computer. All right. So tonight we are doing the final book, book 4 of Lewis's Mere Christianity. And again, the book title is Beyond Personality, or the First Steps in the Doctrine of the Trinity. So chapter 1 is entitled Making and Begetting. And I'll just kind of leave it open for any observations that you had or questions that you might have had, things that you might want to get clarification on. Did anybody just freeze up at hearing that this was on the Trinity? Did that freak you out? No, Bob and Karen were easy.
No, but this is the section that I object to.
You object
I
to?
object, well, I object to Lewis's undermining and undervaluing of experience.
Okay, I'm just going to turn the camera a bit so that we
Okay,
get
so
Carol. Talk to me about what you're referring
I
to.
am referring, well, there's an example, but he does it 2 or 3 times, where the experiential dimension of faith is not just disregarded, but actually shot down.
Okay,
So he's talking about a man who had, I quite agreed with the man. I think he had probably had a real experience of God in the desert. And he found them to be, the creeds to be less exciting, but that doesn't mean a thing.
oh, and I actually thought Lewis validates that. And
But it
even,
has no meaning.
well, it does. It just has a contextual meaning.
Yeah,
And I think he works really hard at what he values but then he does say, but there is something valuable about the creeds too, that your experience won't lead you to.
math is absolutely necessary. The creeds are absolutely necessary.
Right.
Which is fine. I mean, I don't disagree with that.
Yeah.
But I do really take exception to how much it discounts the personal experience. And later on, he says that it avails you nothing. If
Right.
and I disagree
So-
with that completely. I think personal experience is very formative for the
But
growing Christian.
I don't think you're actually dealing with Lewis. I think you're hearing something, you're getting triggered, and you're skipping over what he's actually saying. So you're not actually dealing with his
Let me try.
argument or engaging with his point. You just want him to say something. He hasn't said what you want him to say, and so you're disregarding him rather than reading him charitably and trying to wrestle with what it is he's trying to say.
David, what chapter are you in?
Chapter
one.
1 of book 4.
Oh, okay, I wasn't sure. Thanks.
Yeah, and
So
it's on the first
Lewis
few
starts
pages.
off with about a man who says he has no interest in the church and the creeds and all that kind of stuff. For him, God is just that feeling that he gets as he looks out on the Atlantic. And so Lewis begins by saying, in a sense, I quite agreed with the man. He does affirm, he says, I think he probably had a real experience of God in the desert. And then when he turned from the experience to the creeds, he really was turning from something real, the experience of God, to something less real, which is what the creeds have. So my opinion, he does affirm the man, but then he wants to go beyond that and make some additional points. Andrew's now here with us.
Oh, hi.
Yeah, Andrew.
Hi.
So, I mean, his final point is, if you just stick with the feeling you have looking out over the Atlantic, that tells you nothing about God, tells you nothing about your responsibility. So it's not that it's not a real experience, just that experience won't inform you or lead you to the
And
new
that's what I
life.
disagree with. I think that experience will definitely help. And I think many Christians come into.
Okay, so when you say help, then you're assuming that there's something that plus.
Yes.
And I think that's what Lewis is saying too. That plus the creeds is
No, I
fine.
hear him saying that isn't
But
any
if
good.
Lewis is saying if that's all it is, a feeling as you look at the Atlantic, that tells you nothing about God.
And I
Tells you
disagree
something
with that.
about your feeling.
No, I disagree with that. That's what general revelation is. It's calling to God. God's calling to you through the general revelation.
But that doesn't tell you about Jesus, doesn't tell you about the cross.
No, but
doesn't
it does
have
draw you in, and it's a
into
starting
what
point
though?
into the faith,
There's
into
nothing.
further exploration.
No, Lewis is saying there's nothing more because you're only looking out over the Atlantic. Now you just said, then it leads you into the church, which is the creeds, which is what Lewis says. So you're agreeing with Lewis.
But I don't agree with the undermining that he does of the experience. I think the experience is a significant part.
I think you're misreading Lewis. I don't
Okay.
think you're reading charitably. How about others? Just gonna get Andrew on camera here. He's ready for his close-up. So just to pick up for Lewis, he sees theology as a map. So learning and thinking about Christian doctrines, if you stop there, is less real and less exciting than the sort of thing my friend got in the desert. Doctrines are not God. So that's really important to catch, that they're a map. But then he says there's something about a map that has an advantage over the individual's experience, which is that you have maps are comprised of hundreds of people's real experience with that same encounter with God, and then are put together in a way. So a map will give you a sense of God in some ways fuller than what your own experience can give you, although we have to understand that there's still a one-off, whereas that experience in the desert, it seems to be unmediated.
So there's a part that stood out to me a
Okay.
little ways ahead. And there was an allusion to the world of Narnia, I think.
Oh,
And he
nice.
talks about Christianity claims to be telling us about another world.
Right. So is this in chapter 1 still?
Yeah.
Okay, good.
About something behind the world we can touch and hear and see. Do you know where I am now? Down a little bit.
I don't, but that's okay.
Okay. Because I have it on page 137, but that's not your page.
No, I'm in the 150s.
Oh, okay. Anyway, you may think the claim false, but if it were true, what it tells us would be bound to be difficult.
There we go. found it. 156 in mine.
Oh, yeah. So, yeah, I just thought right away, like he is alluding to, another world that we had just studied in the Narnia books.
Right.
But-
So can you unpack a little bit what happened in Narnia that you hear being echoed here?
Well, it's a different world that not everyone can be a part of. Not everyone can see and touch and feel. And the children were privy to this.
Yeah.
Not everyone in the world is privy to this other world.
Okay.
So,
Good.
yeah. I can see how it's difficult, though, for people to talk about this and understand it.
Right. Yeah. And he kind of addresses that, right?
Yeah.
In one of these chapters about it, people's insistence that it should be simple. So he talks about at the center of theology is this idea of becoming sons, and I would say in our modern way, we would phrase it, sons and daughters of God. And particularly about Jesus being begotten and not created. What did you make of that?
It made perfect sense to me because I like to create, but nothing that I make is anything like me.
Right.
Whether art or jewelry or crocheting, but you beget your children.
Right.
They're like you.
So
So-
Ryan and Cheryl are like you in a way
That's
that an Afghan is not like you.
That's right. So God created man, but he beget Jesus.
Okay.
Okay. So
And
to
have
me,
you thought of it in those terms before?
probably not. That's the joy of trying to get in C.S. Lewis's head.
Uh-huh. Well, and again, that's the creeds too, right?
That's right.
I believe in God, the Father Almighty, maker of heaven and earth, and in Jesus Christ, his only begotten Son. And particularly important, he's doing a really good job of avoiding heresies. So I'm just trying to see if it's here that he talks about it. Actually, I don't think. Oh, okay, it's not in this chapter that he talks about it. So we'll just hold off. I really liked that he used the two different words for life. So meaning the animal life and then the higher life to come. I thought that was really helpful. Bios and Zoe.
David,
Yes.
can you explain to me the last little paragraph of that chapter 1? And he
And-
talks about the great sculptor's shop. We are statues.
Okay, and that is precisely what Christianity is about. It begins that way.
Yeah.
This world is a great sculptor's shop. We are the statues, and there is a rumor going around the shop that some of us are someday going to come to life. Okay, so he is seeing this world as kind of the first step in God's desire to make creatures like himself, right? So it starts with we might say the lower, the bios type of life, And then his desire is to take that bios life and give Zoe life. So it's kind of, I was thinking Pinocchio is almost a good way to think of this. You know, we have this wooden puppet that, because of a wish, is animated, right? Can speak and all that kind of stuff, but he has his longing to become a real boy. And finally, in the end, the blue fairy makes him a real boy, right? So it's that same kind of promise or hope, where we were once puppets. There's coming a time, or at least there's a rumor going around that there's coming a time when we will be real children.
So there was something that kept running through my mind when I was reading these parts. It is, what about Adam and Eve before the fall?
Okay.
Were they not created in God's image? Like, were they not sons and daughters of God at that point? And then something broke that. or
So
something.
they were created in God's image, but they're still made, not begotten. And so Jesus is always plan A. Jesus is never plan B. It's not like God started off with this perfect human family and then everything went wrong. So then we have always been destined to be conformed to the image of the Son. So what we don't know is what would have been the process should Adam and Eve not have fallen, for them to be given that higher life. But theologically, they were always destined to have life in Christ. Mom, are you thinking, or did you freeze? Oh, there we go.
I might have froze, but
Yeah.
I was also thinking.
Yeah. And so think of the witch's courtyard, Natasha, when we talk about the statues, right? And that's sort of a foreshadowing of the resurrected life, right? All right, well, let's move into chapter 2, the three-personal God. Anything stand out to you there? I thought it was interesting where he starts off, where he talks about kind of the public man on the street kind of view about God. I believe in a God, but not in a personal God. So that's not a new thing. Deism is the idea of a creator that made the world. And you can think of it as like a clockmaker, makes a clock, puts all the pieces together, winds it up, and then walks away from the clock. He's not intimately connected to the clock. The clock doesn't need him to run. It's a mechanism. And so a lot of early American Christianity was actually deistic, not theistic. And so this is echoing that same sort of thing. I have no problem with the idea of a God, like it makes sense. How do we get here? But I don't believe in a personal God. So for those folks, it's more of a something behind all the other things. And again, he's not shooting that down, but he wants to say Christianity is offering us something more than that general vague sense. And he says it's unique. Only Christianity offers a vision of the personality about God, whereas really when people talk about it, they're actually thinking of something more impersonal. But the Christian vision of a threefold God, tri-person God, is highly personal. And there isn't another religion or doctrine like that in other religions. So this stands unique, and for that reason is very important.
I really like that image of a person trying to get in touch with God,
Yeah,
and then no God that's prompting him to pray.
right.
You know, yeah, that's neat. It's kind of cyclical, but it's a neat cyclical thing.
So talk about that. What do you mean when you say it's kind of cyclical?
Well, the way he even writes it makes me think of a circle, like reading it fast in
Yeah,
a circle.
okay, yeah.
So, like an ordinary simple Christian kneels down to say his prayers. He's trying to get into touch with God. But if he is a Christian, he knows that what is prompting him to pray is also God,
Mhm.
so to speak, inside him. But he also knows that all his real knowledge of God comes through Christ, the man who was God. Like, do you feel that circle feeling? Like it's
Yeah.
just,
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah, anytime you think it's me doing it, there's some aspect of God at work.
yeah.
Yeah.
God is the thing inside of him that's pushing him. I suppose there's that imagery there too of pushing.
Yes. Yeah.
The motive, yeah.
And notice that he doesn't lose the mystery of the Trinity, right?
Mm.
So while he gives some concrete illustrations of how we can come to understand it, still involves thinking in terms of another dimension that we don't have access to, right? And so he doesn't deny the difficulty of articulating the doctrine, or, there's nothing that we can point to and say, it's like this, it's outside of our experience. And yet he is able to say, if we were to meet two-dimensional creatures and try to explain our three-dimensional world, that would seem as puzzling to them as the doctrine of the Trinity is to us. So we get something more than a person when we encounter God, something that we could never have guessed. And then there's this moment of invitation, right? You may ask, if we cannot imagine a three-personal being, what is the good of talking about him? Well, there isn't any good talking about him. The thing that matters is being actually drawn into that three-personal life. And that may begin anytime tonight, if you like. I really like that. Again, thinking about this being presented to what might be called a secular audience, or duns. And I also like that he talks about and emphasizes that this isn't done, even though it's God with us, helping us, it isn't done against our will. So even though he's being pulled into God by God, he is still remaining himself or herself. And that's really important, because we don't lose ourselves in God. That's the importance of the otherness, right? The creation and the creator. So again, this is part of that roadmap of the creeds that he's talking about, because when we have the desert experience, that doesn't tell us about the three-person God.
I also liked where Lewis talked about sort of the whole idea of the corporate body of the church. And he's, that means not simply to men who are individually good, but to men who are united together in a body, loving one another, helping one another,
Right.
showing him to one another. For
Yeah.
that is what God meant humanity to be like players in one band or organs in one body.
Yes.
I mean,
Yes.
I think about it in terms of that's what he wants for the church, but he's going further than that.
Yes. Yeah. He's saying pull the lens back, and we see not a collection of individuals, but one human organic mass that spreads out across time and space. More like a tree than just a clump. I thought that was a beautiful picture. And again, his point when it comes to the simplicity argument, he says, of course, if we are making Christianity up, we can make it easier. So its actual complexity points to its factness. And which is also why he wants to stay with a church that has historical roots, and he's not just running after everybody who has a new idea, which is really important for our culture because we are very attracted to the new. We get bored fairly quickly and easily. So in some ways, it's kind of like Tolkien, right? You go to ancient lore in the Lord of the Rings. It's the elders that have wisdom. Whereas our culture is always looking for the new person, the youth, celebrity, all that kind of stuff, right? And he says that, of course, happens in other disciplines. And when that person has made their splash and faded away, then the real science or whatever is still going on, plodding away. Well, that leads us into chapter 3, Time and Beyond. That clock will not help us at all. 7:32. Did anybody skip this chapter since he gave us permission?
Nope.
So he starts to go into the idea of prayer. And particularly an argument that would say, I don't understand how God can hear everybody all at once. And so he starts to talk about a dimension of time, God's relative position to that time. What did you make of all of that? Was that helpful? Or did you wish that you had skipped it? I'm looking at you, Bob.
For me, it was more about how, we talk about theoretically, we talk about how, you know, things are going along in a certain way and then a roadblock happens, or we think it's a roadblock. And, you know, 10 years later, maybe we discover, oh, that's one of the best things that ever happened to me. You know, God, now I see that that was God's plan for my life or whatever.
Right.
And that whole idea that God's outside of that continuum of time.
Hmm.
And 1,000 years ago and 1,000 years in the future, he can see them all right now.
Right.
Now being a relative term.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
That was helpful for me in sort of getting a bigger picture, like of that concept,
Yeah. Good.
and making it easier to understand and I guess accept.
Right. Maybe at least suspend judgment for the moment.
Correct. Yeah.
I think for me, I never struggled with this. How does God, listen to several 100 million people all asking him things, and how does he answer them? I never played that ping pong game. My faith was in God. He's God. He's capable of doing everything. He created it all. So I never had to do any hurdles with that thought process. But I could see Lewis wants to try to, he tries to cut through all of this and
Right.
lay those foundations for somebody who would say, well, how does this happen?
Yes.
You know, I mean,
Yeah.
and did he explain it the best way? Who could ever explain it the best way? How do you explain how God is outside of time?
How would we know if we explained it the best way? We would have to have access to that standard.
Yeah. For me, it's just again, like Natasha kind of said, it's just simple. I keep it simple. It's a simple faith, a simple belief.
Yeah.
God
Yeah.
hears.
I think you're right, though. All the way through, he seems to have examples of people said this to me, people said that to me. So I think he's hearing this to some degree, and he just wants to take this opportunity. Okay, if this is a challenge for some people, then let's ask the question and answer it and see if we can clear that obstacle out of the way. Because that's what apologetics seeks to do, right? It's not so much to prove that we're right, it's to hear people, to say there are real questions, real challenges that people struggle with in their thinking. And if we can take those seriously, if we can answer their questions, it's not that we can argue them into the kingdom, but we may move some of the obstacles out of the way. And again, he often talks about his own journey, right? When I was an atheist, I used to think this, I would make this argument. Now, as I encountered this is how I would answer myself. So, yeah, I find it pastorally helpful when you talk to people who are struggling with their character or sins or that kind of stuff, and have an idea of God being the morality police, saying, oh, I messed up again, and how long will God, put up with this? It's very much, the idea seems to be God looks at my unfolding life and sin in the same way that I do. And I think this is helpful to say, actually, God sees you in your wholeness, your entire story. And that's what he's looking at. He's not 1 minute happy and pleased with you, next minute wrathful with you, like impatient 1 minute, merciful the next. There, he is dealing with you in a whole. And I think Lewis is really good to say, so no matter how many billions of people, trillions of people there ever will be, God is dealing with them one at a time, one-on-one, intimately, personally. And from a pastoral position where you're trying to give somebody who's distraught comfort, that's very comforting and really good news. Was anybody thrilled when he said, with him, it is so to speak still 1920 and already 1960? Could you imagine? There's also the dynamic of the incarnation that he deals with a little bit there. God is everywhere and keeps the whole universe going. Once he became a human being, then how did the universe keep going while he was a baby or while he was asleep? So he kind of deals with that aspect of things as well. And again, we might not have ever had those thoughts or, overly wrestled with that kind of thing, but somebody out there might, and he's given us some direction of how we might have that conversation.
I think this is classic for him. He's not afraid to put anything down on the table and,
Right.
and present it, because if it does apply to that person, there's a little bit of framework he tries to give them to navigate it.
Yeah.
And it isn't just like you said at the beginning, well, then just skip this chapter. Go to the next.
Yes.
Go on.
Yeah.
But
This makes your brain hurt.
When he was putting all his thoughts together, and I guess these were presentations more in the beginning,
Yeah.
he was well prepared. He prepared every kind of aspect of what Christianity is and what's time and what's, he's a very intelligent man.
Yeah.
To be able to put that all down and trying to give an example.
Yeah. He also talks about free will a little bit. Sorry, Bob, did you have more?
Well, it was just, that's the way I kind of, every chapter, I kind of had that feeling. He was trying to put someone at ease, put you at ease. This is what it is. This is what it is. And if he could present an example, then that was something that you could picture in your mind and try to frame around,
Yes.
around the principle.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. So again, if this doesn't help you, leave it alone. Move on. Chapter 4, we have the good infection.
COVID.
COVID, yeah. Yeah.
I'm reading you.
This is a good infection.
So he starts off with asking us to imagine two books lying on a table, one on top of the other. Bottom book is keeping the other one up. So the underneath book is A, the one on top B. So A is causing the position of B. Oh, here's where we get to really important. So when he talks about the life of the Trinity, the way the Cappadocian Fathers, which is who he's following in a lot of his conversation, describes it, and I think he comes at least close to it if he doesn't say it, there never was when the Son wasn't. So part of the argument historically was, if we use the language of begetting, the Father begot the Son was begotten by the Father, then that would indicate source and result. Therefore, there had to be even an infinitesimal moment when there was just God, the Father, and then the second thing came into being as it was begotten. The Son was begotten. And so this was a fairly big deal in the early church, how to talk about this, because that has implications, right? And Jesus, or the second person of the Trinity, isn't co-equally God, but is a God, shares some of the divine life, but is lesser. So the way the fathers put it was, there never was when the Son wasn't. So the Son is eternally begotten of the Father. The Father eternally begets the Son. So there's no sequence. There is always them. Again, we can't really use the language of time because, as he's just explained, God is not in time.
Here comes that brain ache again.
Yeah, yeah. And again, when it comes to the Trinity, so the best articulation we can give for the Trinity is the creedal formulas that the church has worked out for centuries and is held, such as I think it's the Athanasian Creed. And so it's a confession because ultimately it's a mystery, right? We can talk about it, we can describe it, we can even argue about it. But at the end of the day, we can only affirm certain things. We cannot prove it. So there's no before and after about it. So yeah, he says the Son exists because the Father exists, but there was never a time before the Father produced the Son. So that's another way of saying there never was when the Son wasn't. And I thought the imagination, a good illustration. You know, I ask you to imagine those two books and they come into being at exactly the same time, and yet one is on top of the other, it's seemingly supported. They came into being at the same instant, and yet they're distinct. Now, of course, that breaks down as an illustration. All illustrations will break down somewhere, especially when we're talking about the triune nature of God. And we should note too, that some of the, even his language can move to what were early heresies. So the sun is not like light from a lamp. That is to talk about two modes. That's modalism. So again, which is why we come back to the creeds as the best articulation, because the second we start to try and describe or explain, we fall into some heresy that the church has dealt with and has resolved through the creed. And of course, he comes back to, I think, very wisely, the language of Scripture. It's one of the reasons why it's important. So while we say there's no gender in God, there is something in the fact that God has revealed himself as Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. It doesn't talk about maleness, but it does talk about relationship. And that's important. So you'll hear me talk at times about what we might understand as female qualities about God. There are those expressions in the Bible, but at the end of the day, it's better to know God as Father than to know God as Mother, without losing the sense that he is neither male nor female, and he is not father or mother in the sense that we would talk about our own parents. And
So,
he's, yeah, go ahead.
so David, in your years of pastoring and sharing the gospel with people, how did you try to explain that third person, the Holy Spirit, to someone? Did you try to use the way Lewis did, or how would you try to present that to someone?
For ordination papers, you answer that kind of question. For theology exams, you answer that kind of question. I've never had the experience of needing to explain the Trinity to anybody. I think I could do it. But at the end of the day, again, I don't approach these things as something to be proven, but something to declare. And what I always, especially if I'm talking to people, want them to hear is this is God's empowering presence with us. We're not left alone. So, there might need to be some conceptual conversation. If you're talking to a Muslim and they confess Allah is one, a Jewish person, Hero Israel, Yahweh, your God, is one God. The doctrine of the Trinity is difficult, and you're probably going to have some conversation around it and how you understand it and how it works. I have not had that privilege or that challenge. So personally, as I talk to people, if I'm talking about the Holy Spirit, I'm talking about that God is with us and he has poured out his Spirit on us, and he desires to fill us, to lead us, and to empower us for faithful living. But Natasha will have to answer questions like that soon. I do like too the way that he says, this really deepens our understanding of Scripture's claim that God is love. That has deep meaning because there is a triune God, because there's more than just a single entity there. It's also important when we talk about God and his reasons for creating. God wasn't lonely. God didn't need us. But if we do understand that creation is birthed out of love and his desire to share that love with something that is other than himself, and to draw that other into the very life of the interpenetrating love of the triune Godhead, that speaks volumes. So I heard that sentence come out of my mouth and I thought that sounded really heavy for Wednesday night. Yeah, love is living and dynamic activity that has been going on forever and will go on forever and will include us in a more full way one day.
So right near the end of the chapter,
Yeah.
he said something that kind of shocked me a little bit. And after reading more and thinking about it more, I'm not sure why it shocked me at first, but it did. It said every Christian is to become a little Christ.
Right.
The whole purpose of becoming a Christian is simply nothing else. And I was like, well, what? I have to think
Yeah.
about that.
Yes. Which may be some of that language may trigger you because of your mother and her new age perspective. Could easily adopt that kind of language.
That's true. Yeah. Yeah, they were all gods.
Yeah. So my grandmother, my mom's mom, was on the cutting edge of the new age movement of her day. So really into spiritualisms and that sort of thing. But yeah, at the end of the day, we will be conformed to his image, and that process has already begun. which is why we put off the old self and put on Christ.
Yeah, later on, he talks about, dress up. Oh,
Right.
that was, again, a little bit of a shocking thought, but it actually was kind of helpful as
Yes.
well.
Yeah. Well, and that takes us into the Obstinate Toy Soldiers chapter.
I was just gonna say to Mary, that this is just again how I think Lewis tries to put words to it. Last saying we're little Christ. It was his way to really say, yeah, Christ is in us and we're
Mhm.
that example around. So I guess we're little Christs. But I mean, it's not language that we go around and share with someone. Hey, I'm a little Christ.
Yeah, that's right.
We say we're Christian, which what does that mean? Oh, you're a little Christ.
Mhm.
I think it's really cool how he wasn't afraid to throw that out there.
Exactly. And it gets you thinking. I mean, I said earlier my brain hurts, but what I really should say is he stimulated the little gray cells.
Poirot.
We-
So he starts off chapter 5 with a classic articulation. The Son of God became a man to enable men to become sons of God. So that is saying the same thing that you just pointed out, Mom, that he said at the end of the last chapter, that the whole purpose of us being Christian is to become little Christ. This is saying that same thing a little differently in a more classical articulation. And there's he touches on the Adam and Eve question that you had earlier as well. I don't know how things would have worked if the human race had never rebelled against God and joined the enemy. But the human destiny was always to conform to the image of the Son of God. Something that we'll hear as we do the Narnia series is Aslan often says, I don't tell you what would have happened. I only tell you what will happen now if you do this. So I think Lewis is echoing that same sort of thing. I don't know what would have happened. I mean, maybe, but at the end of the day, we got to deal with the world the way that it is. Human creature did rebel. And here we are. We are incorporated into Christ in this way. So you and I are concerned with the way things work now. So he talks about, I said a moment ago, part of our process of being transformed is to put the old self to death and to put on Christ. That's basically the nutshell of this chapter. Where he says the natural life, the life of rebellion, the life that's been colored by sin, where the image is not effaced, but is broken, marred, but not effaced. It's not erased. So we are still image bearers, but we are not the kind of image bearers that we are meant to be in the first place. And so as a result of that, our natural lives are actually in direct opposition to the spiritual life that God desires for us. And because of that, we're self-centered and we want to protect ourselves. We can be quite antithetical to that new higher life.
It reminds me of Paul saying, that I find myself doing that which I don't want to do.
Romans 7, indeed.
Yeah.
Yes.
We all have these battles.
Yes. And it's interesting, you know, his little illustrations. So imagine you have a tin soldier and you want him to come to life, but from that tin soldier's perspective, that would kill him. To take on flesh and to give up tin would be to, in essence, change him in such a way that he's not sure that he can recognize himself any longer. And so he starts to get into the incarnation, which is really important, one of the most important doctrines, right? So an early church father, Cyprian, says, nothing has been redeemed that Christ didn't take on himself. And so we have the divine life, this higher life, takes on our life and comes and enters our tin soldier nursery. And he goes to death. Because of course, that's what is necessary to happen. So this is where he talks about the humanity being spread out in time from God's own view, is not separate things dotted about, but one single growing thing, much like a very complicated tree. And because of that unity of humanity, when Jesus changes in the resurrection, that spreads to the rest of the organism. So it's almost like the infection inverted. Rather than being infected with death, the organism is now infected with life. N.T. Wright puts it, it's almost like, you know, have you ever blown up a balloon, put a piece of Scotch tape on it, and then pushed a pin in it, and it slowly releases the air? So it's kind of the opposite of that. If you put the pin in, then it starts to inflate the balloon rather than deflate the balloon. So he has a few different ways of saying that. And he talks about the different ways that we would talk about this new life being given to us. But the point is that it is done for us. It's not something that we can do. So it's 8 o'clock. We've got some more chapters. We have half an hour scheduled. But how are people doing? Do you want to wrap it up here, or do you want to keep going? I understand this can be tough slugging, this stuff. I think Bob and Karen are saying keep going. Well, that is overwhelming. Okay. So chapter 6 then, 2 notes. So one is, why did God not beget many sons? Instead of making toy soldiers and then bringing them to life. such a painful process. So what did you think of that question and answer?
That's really okay, man.
That's right. I think that God wanted, he made man because he wanted people to choose to love him. If he wanted people that were forced to love him, he could have just churned out some more angels.
Right.
He was looking for a different type of relationship.
Okay. Good. So yeah, he hits on free will there.
Mhm.
So he does push against a universalism, because in the last chapter, it sounded like humanity is one big mass. The new life has started. It's going to infect the whole thing, right? We could assume that that's where things are going. But he says, no, actually, we're free. And there are people who reject it. So this process is necessary for God to accomplish his goal of having free, loving creatures that choose him, as opposed to mindless machines or automata that have no choice. And perhaps without free will, there can be no real love, right? Also talks about the two pennies and distinguishing them. I thought that was an interesting thing to think of. So there's something kind of necessary in being a father and a son, but to have a father and two sons might be difficult. That was an interesting thing to think about as I read it. The second thing, he says the whole human race is, in a sense, one thing, one huge organism like a tree. Must not be confused with the idea that individual differences do not matter, or that real people are somehow less important than collective things like classes, races, and so forth.
But we're all a bit different and we all do different things.
Yes.
But as the one thing, the human race, we should care for and help one another.
Right. That's right. Yeah. So the idea that I shouldn't bother with my neighbor because they have nothing to do with me, not part of my tribe, my class. He says, actually, we're all one organism, then we are distinct, but we are united, and we do have to do with each other. We are in relation to each other. And again, as I think it was said earlier, that's part of what it means to reflect the image of God, right? Again, we have this unity and diversity in the Trinity that seems to be married or mirrored in the human experience. And then he gives us a little spiritual warfare note, which I thought was good. Be careful that we don't start thinking in terms of what's worse, because the devil likes to come at us in pairs. So if he can't get us coming, he'll get us going. So walking between
I
the,
thought that was a great lead in to the screw tape letters.
yes, 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 yes. So then we get into chapter 7, and let's pretend, and we talked about it a bit. We have the Beauty and the Beast, and then a person who wears a mask, which makes him look nicer than he really was. But then when the mask comes off, he finds that that mask has actually made him more beautiful as a result.
The old fake it till you make it.
So now he's saying, okay, so application, right? Where does this all land? We've had some theory. Now, what do we do with it? So he talks about saying your prayers. And he points to the Our Father prayer. And he points us to the fact that when we pray that, and we recognize that we are saying something that is less true for us than it is to Jesus, and yet we're invited into it. And he talks about the difference between Jesus praying the prayer and us praying the prayer, but that we can't get away from the fact that we're ordered to do it. And that's really important. Again, I tend to think pastorally, right? So there are people that don't want to do certain things, take communion, say the Lord's Prayer, overly pray, things like that. And often it's because I'm not good enough. I'm not Jesus, therefore I shouldn't. But it's actually the opposite that seems to be the truth, that because you're not Jesus, you have been commanded to do it, you are to do it, and this is part of the process of letting the old self die and putting on Christ in its stead. So he goes on to say, what's the good of pretending? And he distinguishes between two kinds of pretending. There's the bad kind, pretense instead of the real thing. Somebody who pretends they're going to help you, but then doesn't. But then there's also a good kind where the pretense leads up to the real thing. So you don't feel particularly friendly, but you behave in a friendly manner. And you find as you begin to do that it is easier, and you do in fact feel friendlier as a result. And he points us to the importance of children's games. And again, he is echoing our spiritual fathers. Prayer and play are interrelated practices in the Christian life. To play is just as important as to pray. And playing as children prepares us to be adults. I suppose it's important to play the right games. And so as you dress up as Christ, if you really were a son of God and you have these sorts of thoughts, well, then you stop them. Or if you should be downstairs writing a letter or helping your wife, well, then you go and do it. So here he's echoing things like John the Baptist, right? People hear this good news. What should I do? Well, be satisfied with your wages. Don't gouge people. Don't rob them. If you're taking taxes, do that. And so there's just, this is what you do. You figure out what it means to be a son of God, and then you do that as if that's who you are. So again, N.T. Wright would put this, become what you are. You have been made sons and daughters of God. That's your status. Now you become in practice what you are in status.
I think what he's trying to project here is the progression of a Christian as you become, when the reality is starting to come in, that now you're moving forward in Christ, and you're, starting to make some of these decisions, and all of a sudden you realize you're not pretending anymore. You are like Christ.
Yes.
You're,
And he's
you're transitioning.
Yeah.
So,
And he's avoiding the danger that often evangelical falls into, and we've talked about it in other courses, of conversion. like you become a Christian, you believe something, you tick the box, and then there's nothing after that. Intimately related to salvation is this understanding that we become children of God, and children of God behave in the character of God. And so there's no divorce between justification and sanctification. There's no divorce between becoming a Christian and being a Christian. So it's not a secondary thing. It's all of a part. It's all one.
Yeah, but I guess, you have to come into the reality as, you're an individual, that you are in this process.
Yes.
You can't just watch somebody else or, and try to copy them or whatever. It has to become a reality in your life.
But it might start there. So Paul says, imitate me as I imitate Christ.
Yeah, no, I'm not trying to, I'm just trying to stay with how Lewis is trying to think here and how he's trying to draw this.
Yeah.
He's the one who's saying we're pretending, we're, this is a reality now. Oh, all of a sudden our reality is we're Christ-like.
Right.
Then he tries to pull in the conscience, instead of the Holy Spirit, it's the conscience. Is how does that play with a person? So he's trying to do a good dance here to.
Yeah. But notice that he says the conscience is not a good guide.
Yeah, no, he's fleshing it out really well, because someone would say, well, that's my conscience. I've got, that's what I'm following, my conscience. Well, no.
Yeah. Well, and I wanted to raise that because I'm remembering at some point, I don't know if it was in book 1 of Mere Christianity, where we had a conversation around conscience. And I said that following your conscience can be problematic. And so Lewis is here saying that same sort of thing. To follow Christ is different than to follow your conscience. Because again, the conscience can be part of that natural self that wants to be self-centered and self-protecting.
He brings in that good infection again.
Yeah.
You're being infected, a good infection of the person.
Right. And again, what Natasha noted in the earlier chapter, we have again of Christ himself, the Son of God, who is man just like you, and God just like his Father is actually at your side and is already at that moment beginning to turn your pretense into a reality.
Yeah.
So again, there is a lot of times when I talk to people pastorally, the work that we have to do is submission, in some ways, to get out of God's way, to allow him to work, and simply to stop resisting, stop the fighting.
Yeah, at the end of the chapter, there's this powerful image where it says, God looks at you as if you were a little Christ.
Right.
And then there's this image of Christ stands beside you to turn you into one.
Yes.
Yeah, that is a powerful image.
Yeah.
That's all.
And in my notes, I've got, so this must be in a chapter somewhere, I'm hoping. As Christ changes us, we make 2 discoveries.
Yeah.
We see how sinful we are, and we
Yeah.
can't change that ourselves.
Yeah.
And then the other one, that God does everything. He sees us as we are, and God helps us change.
Yes. Yeah. That's on 192 and 193 in my book. I've preached on this before. I've talked about it before. Our problem isn't our individual sin. It's I am somebody that likes to sin. I am a sinner, right? And so there's that need for the death of me.
Yeah. I also wrote down, and hopefully it's in there too, just above that I've got here, don't pin your hope or your faith on any human being.
Right. Yeah, yeah. Yeah. You said that was before that?
Well, in my notes it is, so who knows where it is in the book.
Well, in the paragraph before, it talks about put right out of your head the idea that these are only fancy ways of saying that Christians are to read what Christ said and try to carry it out. As a man may read what Plato or Marx said and try to carry it out. They mean something much more than that. They mean that a real person, Christ, here and now in that very room where you are saying your prayers, is doing things to you.
Yeah.
It is a living man.
Mhm.
Okay. Then, is Christianity hard or easy?
Chapter 8.
So we're now away from morality and doing good.
I think the bottom line is it's both. Sometimes it seems easy, other times not so much.
Yeah,
At least that's been my life experience.
yeah.
I mean, Lewis brings up, take up your cross. And again, he's using that analogy of the dying. And
Yes.
I keep referring back to Paul, I have been crucified with Christ and I no longer live, but Christ lives in me. I
Yeah.
think that's something that's got to keep, for me anyway, it has to keep ricocheting in my brain all the time.
Yeah.
Because I'll pick up something else
Yeah.
that's not Christ-like, and really I shouldn't be
Mhm.
wasting my time picking that up.
Yeah.
I need to be crucified. And so I need that as a trigger for me to go, oop. Paul said, I have been crucified with Christ. I need to crucify that. I need to get rid of that.
Yeah. And I think that that's a key paragraph that you point to, Bob, where he says both harder and easier than what we are all trying to do. You have
Right.
noticed, I expect, that Christ himself sometimes describes the Christian way as very hard, sometimes as very easy. He says, take up your cross. In other words, it is like going to be beaten to death in a concentration camp. Next minute, he says, my yoke is easy and my burden light. He means both. And one can just see why both are true. So the terrible thing, the almost impossible thing, is to hand over your whole self, all your wishes and precautions to Christ.
Mhm.
But that in itself is far easier than what we try to do instead of giving ourselves up, to keep doing or remaining ourselves, to keep personal happiness as our aim in life, and at the same time to try and be good. Because of course, those things are antithetical.
Now, Lewis always uses that's the natural life. I always bring in that there's the evil one he's pounding that drum.
Yes.
You should do this. You should do this. And I don't know, Lewis keeps saying natural life. Is that the natural, or is that just the evil? That's the sin.
Well, but we have to remember that the natural life is now demonic because of
He
the
never uses
fall.
that language though.
Yes. Well, he does. And we've seen even tonight where he's pointed at, remember, the devil always comes at you in pairs, and we
Yeah.
have to avoid the ditches.
Yeah, that's true. It is.
So he has a keen awareness of the
Oh, yeah.
satanic world, but I think he doesn't want to, and I think he's right, it's not like the devil stands outside of us and works in a supernatural way. The devil works on us, and therefore he works in us. So the devil is expressed through our own sinful flesh. And therefore, that's where the devil needs to be fought, is in our natural life.
Yeah.
And again, he's talking to a secular audience that in some ways you talk about the devil too much and they're out of there, right? But they can't understand about themselves that they are selfish and that they have these natural inclinations, which
Yeah, that's the thing that I always keep the context of him speaking and his time and all that. So he's very careful in the language he's using to reach the audience in the right way.
yes, yeah,
And the other thing that this reminds me of is that, we're living in enemy occupied territory
right,
and we're bombarded all the time. Our natural selves are,
yeah,
it's easy to get distracted and led astray, as it were.
yeah. So he points to when scripture says we are to be perfect, it means it. But it does mean the transformation is necessary. And he comes back again to this is the whole of Christianity. There's nothing else. It's this transformation. And because he reads his Bible in chapter 9, he talks about counting the cost.
Yes.
And God's insistence that the help that he offers is for us to become perfect, not to help us continue to be imperfect. I thought his illustration about the tooth was really good. I don't want to say anything about it because while they'll deal with the pain in the present, then I'll have to go to the dentist the next day. And he's not just going to touch the one tooth, he's going to look at all the teeth, even the ones that feel fine in this moment. And I thought that's interesting because the dentist is not my favorite person for similar reasons as Lewis. So casting God in that role was difficult, but I thought was a helpful thing. So I think I've used the quote before. God takes us. God loves us so much, he takes us just as we are, but he loves us too much to leave us as we are.
Right. Yeah.
And then there's this sense of realism. And again, Lewis in some ways has a real pastoral heart for all of his theology and philosophy and linguistics. He talks about every time you fall, he will pick you up again. You don't need to worry about this. You don't need to get twisted up in this. So again, I think he has a good balance of understanding who God is and the relationship that God has to us. It is certainly not the angry old man sitting on the cloud waiting for us to screw up so that he can squash us.
I like his language, he says, the command be ye perfect is not an idealistic gas.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah.
Or
Yeah.
it's a command to do the impossible.
Yes.
So, he tries to help you. Don't sweat this.
Yes.
And just a little further on, it talks about how, we get it that at the beginning, things might be a bit rocky, but then you sort of sort things out and you're walking on the straight and narrow, as it were, and then whammo, It's like, why now? Like, what's all this about? And the next line really reminded me of the great divorce,
Oh, yeah.
because God is forcing him on or up to a
Yes.
higher level,
Yes.
putting
And
him
we-
in situations where they have to be very much braver or more patient. Like
Yeah.
it doesn't stop. It's
Yeah. So again, Narnia, the world within the world, great divorce. We'll see it in the last battle again.
mhm.
Getting further into God, as it were.
And the other thing, we didn't touch on it in the last, it's one of the previous chapters, we talks about maybe at first, and for me, my Christian life has been up and down, up and down, up and down. Maybe you can only do a few moments to start, but that's the way it works. I
Right.
found that encouraging for me,
Yes.
that
Yes.
it doesn't have to be, I mean, it's kind of like, okay, it's January 1st, I'm going to eat, a perfect diet, and I'm going to go to the gym every day of the week for 3 hours a day, and
Yes.
da, 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 da. It
Yeah.
doesn't have to be like that.
Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah, it's not instant holiness by any means. Well, my friends, it is 8:30.
Well, we did pretty good.
So I'm going to stop the recording and then